Leah, let's start with you. Can you give us a brief rundown of what the natural resource transfer agreements are and how they came to be?
Yeah, Tansei, and thank you for having me here today. Really appreciate it. I'm coming to you from the St'elas traditional territory. The NRTA has really been unfinished business with the Constitution of Canada and the rights, the inherent and treaty rights of all First Nations in Canada. How it came about in the 1930s was unilaterally Canada providing a jurisdictional over natural resources to the prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. This was done without any consultation whatsoever to the First Nations, and in my opinion, in breach and violation of our treaties. And I say our, I'm from the Pugadawagan area in the Matthias Cologne Cree Nation. We took adhesion to Treaty 6 in 1910. And so our treaties were a nation to nation basis. And when the NRTA happened, there was no engagements or consultation whatsoever from any of my family or community members. So this was a unilateral action of the Crown and the right of Canada. Without that consultation, it remains unfinished business constitutionally, and of course ties right into the issues that we're having with C5 and potentially with other litigations that might be coming forward from different First Nations, stemming from the letter from National Chief Cindy Woodhouse addressing specifically the issues of Treaty 6, 7, and 8 in regards to the proposed separation of Alberta.
Absolutely. And Jennifer, you were at the annual NRTA summit this week. What did you hear there?
Oh, there were a lot of really good conversations. The summit was over 4 days. So it started with ceremony, and then for 2.5 days following that, it was a mix of, people from the Office of the Treaty Commissioner, lawyers that brought perspective on how to actually challenge these injustices and challenge the NRTA and what the NRTA actually means in modern context. First Nations chiefs and their approach on how they view the NRTA and what their step forward actually looks like. Especially as we start to hear more and more about resource development and whether or not nations are participating, because some are, which I think, makes the federal government and provincial governments feel like they can just continue to ram things through because they do find that support out there. But one of the biggest conversations that I heard over the last several days were, the importance of protecting treaty rights, that despite how long ago the treaties were signed and negotiated, we have to continue that fight. And it felt like, I left the summit feeling a renewed sense of hope, but not just hope, but a really, really deep sense of responsibility. I'm a direct descendant of one of the people that interpreted and helped sign Treaty 4. So I feel as a young person leaving that, I'm like, oh man, we have our work cut out for us, because these leaders right now are talking about the importance of treaty and where are our young people going with this, and what are we teaching our young people about the protection and advocacy for our treaty rights.
Yeah, Leah, earlier this year, and you mentioned it briefly there, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations wrote to Prime Minister Mark Carney calling for a review of the NRTA. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Why is that so important?
Yeah, well, that's unfinished business as far as reconciliation goes, at least Canada's commitment to reconciliation and the calls to action under the TRC. And it was really well articulated, in my opinion, with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in the 90s, that publication. And so the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement, because it attracts constitutional laws, and there was no consultation with First Nations, it is a violation of our treaties, and it requires redress because C5 is really all about moving the natural resources and projects that are deemed in the national interest. So in order to advance even Bill C5, you're absolutely going to need to have the voice and the jurisdiction and respecting those treaty and inherent rights of First Nations at the table, first and foremost. Without that, Canada is going to be stymied with litigation of all sorts. And I understand that these issues were raised to the national chief. So she, in fact, wrote that letter to Prime Minister Carney regarding the NRTA. And so this is really unfinished business, and it is a constitutional question that impacts all Canadians, because if the treaty rights of First Nations are violated, there is the potential to violate any other rights under the Constitution of Canada, including the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So I do believe that this is a very salient issue for all First Nations and indeed all Canadians.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds coming up here. Jennifer, what's next for the Western Treaty Nations and the NRTA?
Well, yesterday the transfer of the Sacred Bundle happened, and so it'll be moving on to a community in Alberta. And that means, next year there's going to be a new summit in a new place. But one thing, interestingly enough, I have heard being discussed more and more, and it kind of ties into the conversation of what we're seeing out of Manitoba with the non-confidence vote that some of these nations want to see against the Grand Chief, because they feel as though some of these overarching bodies are essentially making decisions on behalf of the rights holders. That was a big conversation that I was hearing at the tables I was sitting at with chiefs I were talking to, some of the little more grassroots level advocacy that's coming out. So I think what we're going to see is not just a summit happening again, but also more and more grassroots representation on behalf of the rights holders and advocating for treaty, because we're starting to see some of these nations almost break away from these overarching bodies. And when we're hearing about non-confidence votes and we're hearing about people questioning, how capable is the AFN at having the ability to, represent all of these vast different treaties, the treaties 1 to 11 especially. I think we're going to see a lot more grassroots involvement, especially at a nation level.
Leah, a resolution is coming to the AFN Assembly next week that calls for a First Nations-wide state of emergency in relation to the drugs, alcohol, and bootlegging crisis currently devastating First Nations families and communities across Canada. Is this a declaration that's needed?
Oh, absolutely. The toxic drug crisis is directly connected to colonization and all the harms that our people historically and currently are experiencing. And I would say that out in British Columbia, the First Nations Health Authority's done some really good research on why the toxic drug crisis has reached the magnitude it has, and provide statistics on how many First Nations people are involved with that, and statistics such as death and life expectancy. And really what is proposed, and also in the resolution by Chief Angela Levasseur, that'll be read on the floor next week at the AFN Assembly, is about asking the government or compelling the government to provide resources, wraparound care for First Nations who are in crisis. And the symptom of this crisis is the toxic drugs and the use. And so what is proposed is wraparound services of long-term sustainable funding for meeting harm reduction, and also providing people with mental health and wellness tools and resources so that these needs can be met on the community level where it's needed most.
Absolutely, and we're starting to see more of these stories on social media as well. Jennifer, we see a lot of those stories, like I just said, about the violence and the addiction that is plaguing some nations. Exactly how bad is it?
I have a little bit more of, I guess, a negative outlook on it. Having lost a sibling to addiction, which I've been very open about, it feels as though, the addiction takes course. In some cases, in a lot of cases, the lives are lost, and we're becoming so desensitized to the lives that are lost from addiction that I feel like it's been a long time coming to even bring this forward, to declare it a national crisis, because it is a crisis. It's been a crisis in a lot of our families. I've been very close to addiction my entire life, and I think it's time that we don't just talk about it, but we actually address it head on. We fund these services well. We bring wraparound supports in every part of this country. But we also have to remember that even as Indigenous people, we have our own systems and our own ways of knowing, but we're dealing with drugs that are manufactured and they're synthetic. So we have to bring in that, westernized and Eurocentric science in detox and in some of these areas to, medically intervene to bring people off of these drugs safely, but also to give them that long-term support to make sure that the recovery is as successful as possible. But then we also need to be addressing the root cause of crime, the root cause of addiction, the breakdown of family, the child welfare system, all of these things that have detrimentally impacted our people. It's time to also start addressing those issues head on. And I think the federal government has a direct responsibility to act. And I think they also need to work very closely with our provinces to make sure that beds are available, treatment options are there, and we are putting in as low barrier access to services as possible. Shelters, everything. Everyone from city council, MLAs, MPs have a direct responsibility to make sure that they're not just addressing this crisis and putting forward options, but they are making sure that they are doing it with the most information available possible so that these things are successful in the long term.
Those are some interesting points to bring up, because you are right when it comes to the desensitization that we do have. Leah, a growing number of First Nations have been taking matters into their own hands, banishing people, taking away houses, known for illegal drug activity. Is this the way to handle this crisis?
In my opinion, no. Part of the reason why I would say that is because there needs to be some form of intervention with other justice services. So you would need the assistance until we're able to have our own policing services and even our own tribunal courts or tribunals to address people who might be selling drugs or bringing them into the community, and then to the users. And I think those need to be kind of parsed out, because the users need help through a healing journey. But the people who might be bringing those drugs into the community need to go through a judicial or some kind of justice process. Before that, a chief and council can come in and say that they're going to use a BCR to remove people from their communities, because it's a bit of a slippery slope. I understand most First Nations want to make sure that their community members are safe, but it's a double-edged sword where without a proper check and balance in place, the chief and council may be playing judge and jury and police officer on people who may have not been charged with any crime related to the toxic drug crisis.
Absolutely. And Jennifer, finally, I'll get you to weigh in as well. How do you feel about some of the actions First Nations have been taking? Is this the way to handle what's happening?
I think it's my hot take is that it's really unfortunate that we even have to have this conversation, because all of these systems are essentially by design, and our governance systems have been so incredibly hard to deal with that it gets to this point. And now, as First Nations people, we're trying to navigate these really complex situations that we never asked for. But then it makes things difficult, because these chief and councils are tasked with keeping our community safe and our people safe. But also, when you lock someone out or push them away from their collective belonging and their sense of community, the outcome of that is not a good thing. And I think about people that might be struggling or are close to maybe being ready to accept that help and to go onto their healing journey. And, maybe they're days away or maybe they're weeks away, but it doesn't matter, because now they've been shut out of community. And what does that look like when they have to turn to the streets? And that, goes back to, again, break down a family and even break down a community. That's how people get into gangs and get into trouble and that sort of thing. So I don't love it, but I don't know the right answer either when you're tasked with keeping people safe.
Yeah, it's difficult, especially with the both of you also being a part of the community. You can't just walk away from it. So I just want to thank you both today for taking part in this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.